Thanks so much for joining us today. We welcome now the Secretary of State of the great state of Mississippi, Michael Watson. Mr. Secretary, always good to see you, sir. Check your mute there, Mr. Secretary. Check your audio. I think we got you muted. Can't hear you. There we go.
That was a joke.
I got you now. Yeah. All right. Good to see you. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me on again, as always.
Yeah, man. So I got to tell you, when I found out that we were going to be talking about this Corporate Transparency Act and that you have been encouraging our congressional delegation up there in Washington to take a look at this thing and really to repeal it, I started digging into it. I got mad, honestly. I really did. I talked about it on the show earlier. It's like, no, leave me alone here, government. This is no place for you. This is anything but transparency. This is the government digging into my affairs and my business and obtaining more personal information about those who have an equity interest in my business, and they haven't really convinced me that they need it. What about this thing?
That's exactly right, Gerard. We actually had a meeting with them when we were at the National Association of Secretaries of State, and I asked FinCEN specifically, what is this targeting? And obviously, as we've heard the conversations, well, this is about terrorists, washing money through LLCs and shell companies. And I said, well, how many terrorists do you know that really abide by the law? And, they kind of snickered a little bit.
But that was a self-reporting deal, right?
That's exactly right. So they're not going to do it. And then we asked them, well, how are you going to keep up with the number of companies that are in this country and knowing how many aren't reporting? Well, we're not sure about that. Well, how are you going to make sure the business owners know to even do this? Well, we're not sure about that either. They didn't have a single answer for a single question that we offered. And I told them in front of the rest of the crowd, this is a train wreck. It's going to be awful for our small businesses. And then when you start rolling in these $500 fines on small businesses, you're going to put people out of business is what you're going to do.
This is so misguided, so poorly planned. It honestly, Mr. Secretary, this epitomizes everything that's wrong in Washington right here. This is small relative to the big blunders they make. I would agree, but it's just part and parcel of what is happening. If they're serious about combating terrorism, shut down the dang border.
Well, Exhibit A, that's the first place to start, but they don't care about that piece of it. They want to get those folks in to help them register to vote so they can stay in power. That's what that's about at the end of the day. And I'll tell you this, we wrote a letter to Congress, as you mentioned there, to our federal delegation, and the House actually passed a bill that would repeal it. I believe it was end of last year. In the Senate, there's a mirror image over there. I think Senator Tim Scott introduced that. And it's being held up. I see no path forward for it. I talked to both of our senators and their chiefs of staff, and they said, look, we don't see this thing moving. So get ready to buckle up on these fines that are coming. We talked again to FinCEN, I guess a week or so ago. They're reaching out to all the secretaries. And Gerard, basically, they're putting the weight of this on us. It's your job, states, to make sure that your folks know about this. And here's the problem. Gosh. When we do that and we start getting call after call after call, we don't have answers because they don't have answers to us. So then we're the ones that are the bad guys because we can't explain it to them, something that they did. And it's a train wreck. It's awful.
That's a good point. So explain for the audience, you and I, of course, are familiar with the legislation. Explain exactly what the requirement would be.
Yeah, so basically, if you got an LLC or other forms of business, you've got to file now with FinCEN your beneficial owners. So folks that are going to benefit from an ownership stake in your company or your LLC or your corp, you're going to have to report that information to the feds on FinCEN's website. And good luck navigating their website, by the way. So I'm going to go through this really quickly so people can know that the deadline's here. So if you're existing before January 1st of 2024, you have until January 1st of 2025 to report. So you've got a year to get started here. If you created between January 1st of 24 and January 1st of 25, you have 90 calendar days after you receive notice that your filing has been received. And then lastly, if you're created after January 1st, 2025, you have 30 days. And if you don't comply to this, the $500 fines start to kick in on the back end. So The enforcement piece should really scare a lot of folks, but even more sad than that is folks just don't know about it. So you're going to be hitting for something that you're not aware of, and this is thanks to Congress passing this. And oh, by the way, they love to say this was a bipartisan piece of legislation that was stuck in an appropriations bill deep down in the details and the bowels of the bill. So nobody really knows about it.
And it's my understanding that business folks would be notified through email. And if you get an email from the federal government like this, something you're not familiar with, you've never heard of, you've never seen before, I think most people would say this is some sort of phishing scam is what it's going to look like. Because it's an email, my understanding is it's likely to direct you to some link or perhaps included in it where you start feeding it your information. I think the wise person would say, I'm not touching that deal. And then the next thing you know, you're going to get a fine notice in the mail or however they plan to process that and apply that. I don't know. And then you start wondering, oh, did the Fed show up at your door next? Yeah, you didn't give us this information. You know, it's kind of like the IRS comes and padlocks your doors because you're delinquent on your taxes. I mean, who knows? I doubt they've thought through that, what the consequences would be. But I wouldn't trust them on it.
Oh, absolutely not. And again, you talk about the $600 deal. If you're doing business and over $600, you're going to have to start reporting that on some of these payment mechanisms. But let me add to this one more thing there, Gerard. What we have seen is, and you've seen this lately with an LLC in Mississippi, we see these people that are mining the data and basically sending out these forms saying, hey, if you pay me $300, I'll file your annual report for you. Think about that now at the federal level with FinCEN, this beneficial ownership. Folks are going to be getting scammed left and right. It's awful.
The bad guys. They'll have a field day.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
You're probably familiar, Mr. Secretary, with this organization called Harbor Compliance. Are you familiar with those guys? I tell you how I am is because I still have a little business relationship with the state of New Jersey. And I got to tell you, and I know I've shared this with you before, but I want our audience to hear it. I've done business in my business career in a lot of states. This is the easiest state of all the ones I've ever done business with, to do business with. The state of New Jersey has been a great customer of ours for a long time. I still have some remaining business with them that was not part of the sale of my company. The paperwork you have to submit just to be a vendor to them is unbelievable. And there's this third-party registration agent called Harbor Compliance. And they have to carry a lot of your water for you, and you got to pay them for it. You're familiar with this process. I see you shaking your head. But I think I saw them say this is unconstitutional, what this Corporate Transparency Act seeks to do. Even they are saying it.
So I want you to understand this. We've had tax lawyers call us and say, hey, can you explain some of this to us? So this is a tax attorney asking us questions about this. Imagine the small town mom and pop owner who doesn't have a tax attorney and can't afford one trying to comply with this. That's the problem here.
Such a joke. There, as you well know, in the practice of law, tax attorneys are as rare as any, honestly. They're usually concentrated in the large metropolitan areas when they're most needed because they typically get involved in business transactions and combinations that are extremely complex, and they're also very expensive, as you well know. Typically they are. And they provide a very valuable service. I had to engage them in my various business activities. But it's extremely complicated, and you're so right. The average small business who's going to have to comply with this nonsense doesn't have access to that and shouldn't have to pay them for that. That's
right. And one of the other pieces they're concerned about is the liability. Look, what if I mess this up? Then I'm the one that's going to get myself in a lawsuit for somebody getting penalized by the federal government.
So what are the chances, Mr. Secretary, that you join perhaps with some other like-minded secretaries of state and pursue this as a legal matter with the federal government?
So good thing there's a lawsuit that's been filed in Alabama, and the plaintiffs were successful at the lower level, and it's being appealed up, as I understand it. As you probably know, in that instance, that only applies to those plaintiffs for now. If it goes up and there's a broader finding and a broader holding at the Supreme Court, then we could have some relief there. But for now, everyone else that's not a plaintiff in that lawsuit is subject to this law and these penalties.
Unbelievable. And, of course, that consumes our resources, costs taxpayers money to litigate and deal with all this nonsense. It's just a bad deal. Dang, with all the problems we got in this country, this is where they're focused. These are the people that make the whole country work, man. Leave them alone. Good grief. If you can hang around, we can catch you on the other side of the break and get your thoughts on the current legislative session. You good?
Happy to.
All right, we got Secretary of State Michael Watson. He's on the line. We're in the Element Wealth studio. We're visiting with Secretary of State Michael Watson. So I'll just close out, Mr. Secretary, with saying I appreciate your efforts in trying to kill this legislation. Honestly, it's bad legislation. It's bad for business. And in a time when we need business growth and we need to reduce the regulatory burden on business owners, this is just really something that goes in the opposite direction that's going to cost us all money at the end of the day and just generate lots of problems, lots of heartache. I want to share with you that my good friend, Attorney Pepper Crutcher, who has been, he's with Balsha Bingham. He has certainly been a valued member of my business team since the inception of the business. He primarily practices labor law. He says his beneficial owners report took 3 tries and 2 hours. And this guy's a lawyer.
Yeah.
It's pretty much all you need to say, right? Unbelievable.
It flies in the face of our Tackle the Tape initiative where we're trying to cut regulations. And that's one of the reasons we pointed this out. And I think it's important to note, though, I'm not anti-regulation. I'm anti-dumb regulation. And this is one of those ones that had no benefit whatsoever. It's ridiculous.
Good point. All right, so under the dome there, a place you spent a lot of time as a member of the state Senate, I see your folks over there from time to time. They're tracking the many bills that are traversing through the legislature. Of course, tomorrow, big deadline day to pass bills on the floor that came over from the other chamber. What have you been paying attention to during this session? What are you pleased with, and what are you disappointed in?
How long do we have? Look, we've got a couple of really big issues that we've been focused on. Number one, campaign finance reform, and that's been an issue we've talked about quite some time, Gerard. And again, starting back in the summer of last year is when we started launching our ideas and talking to different folks about how we need to revamp our campaign finance laws and to make sure we have some accountability there for Mississippians to understand where's this money coming from and who's using it, who's spending it, who's voting, changing their votes, who's whatever. The whole picture of campaign finance is something we wanted to revamp and give some teeth to those measures. And the second piece that we've really been watching hard is the Tidelands legislation coming through. As you well know, that's been a big issue on the coast. There was another lawsuit that came down Thursday that effectually gutted the entire Tidelands Act from the legislation. So that's a really important piece for us. It was important before, even more so now. So we're looking forward to working on those two pieces here in the next couple of weeks to make sure we get them across the finish line. But that's the big two that we've been focused on.
Something that is certainly related to your office with respect to administration is the ballot initiative. And you know the story there. we had one. It's one way to put it. And now we don't got one. So, and that's because the Supreme Court said, hey, the way this thing is written in the state constitution, it just doesn't add up. The math doesn't work. I don't dispute, honestly, the Supreme Court's action and their ruling. I think they got it right. But since then, our legislature doesn't seem to get that process restored to allow the people to redress their government with a ballot measure process. We can't seem to get the two houses together. I know you've been paying attention to this, but it looks like that's dead for this session as well.
We have. We came out right after that hearing, or right after the Supreme Court ruling came down, and said, look, it's a simple fix. One that I introduced in the our legislature when I was in the state Senate. And basically, you change it to pro rata. That fixes it forever. Basically, the legislature has taken a couple of different looks, and I think they're focused more on just amending statute as opposed to amending the Constitution. in their plan moving forward. And so I think the hiccup there was what's the number of signatures and a couple other pieces that are in there. But quite interesting to watch it happen over there. And again, I believe folks should have that ability to have their voices heard. Ultimately, we work here for the people of Mississippi. And at the end of the day, it's for the consent of the governed. And I think that's a really important piece we need to remember.
So, Mr. Secretary, correct me if I'm wrong, but you introduced this legislation because you were in the Senate then. This was before the Supreme Court struck this thing down, right? You introduced a bill that would have corrected the issue in the state constitution. Now, it was a resolution, I guess, because, right, that would have had to go into the ballot box to amend the provision in the Constitution. The voters would have had to vote on it, but it could have been referred to the ballot by the legislature had your resolution passed. Did I get that right?
Yeah, and there were multiple attempts. It wasn't just me. There were a few others that had filed prior to. So we all saw that hitch, and I think the Supreme Court saw it as well. Obviously, they did when they had the case in front of them. So it's something we tried to fix and weren't able to do it then. But now we don't have a choice. We're going to have to get this thing fixed so the people of Mississippi have their voices heard.
I fear, and I don't want to give anybody any ideas, I'm sure they already have it, that maybe there comes some organized effort to sue the state of Mississippi because there's something in our Constitution that essentially has been struck down. I mean, that gets legally complicated, it would seem, when you've got the Supreme Court saying, well, even though that's in this Constitution, it's really invalid. And then the people may come forward and say, but the Constitution says we're supposed to have this. I mean, how could that possibly play out?
Yeah, and there's, again, it's the mechanism piece of it that it was broken. And again, like you say there, if you're supposed to have that protection in the Constitution, and there are some other pieces in the Constitution that say ultimately, again, it's the voice of the people that should rule the day. So if you've got the mechanism broken there, then hey, let's fix it. And you're right, it may open itself up to some other challenges. And eventually, I think the people, when they get mad enough, they take an extra step, and perhaps it is in the courts. I'm not sure what happens in that arena, but it could very well happen. And Mississippians, again, at the end of the day, like we said, they deserve to have their voices heard, and this is one of the ways that they do that. So we got to get that one fixed.
A big part, of course, of the responsibility in your office is oversight of elections, and I know you and your team take great pride in maintaining election integrity. We got, obviously, the biggest of all coming up in our cycle in our country this fall with the presidential elections. You guys feel like you're prepared for that? And how do you feel about the systems we have in place now, in fact, to make sure that our vote is true and accurate?
Look, I'm incredibly proud, and I think we had a great system in 20. But even adding to that, Kyle Kirkpatrick and our team here in elections have done such a good job of finding where those small little gaps that maybe we could see an issue. For example, we saw an issue where there was an individual who had, I think, north of 20 vote-by-mail applications coming through one residential address. And in SIMS, we didn't have SIMS, a statewide election management system, for those who are listening in. We didn't have a catch for that. And so now if anybody more than, I think it's 4 registrations come from the same address, it pops the flag up so we can check it. Now, look, is it an apartment complex that has the same address for these mailings? That's fine. But if it's a single residence address, we've got a problem when there are north of 20 vote-by-mail applications that are coming in through that same address. So little things like that you may not think are big are huge. And I'm very thankful for our team of going back through and just kind of combing those little small things. What are the extra things that we can do to, again, make sure we're doing all that we can to ensure these things are as clean as possible. And elections aren't perfect. You're going to have small issues here and there, but we're doing everything we can to catch all that we can to make sure Mississippians can trust that the vote that they cast is the one that's counted.
Well, that's good to hear. So whenever certain anomalies like that are detected, it may be nothing to it, but it probably warrants a little investigation just to make sure. And that makes total sense. Of course, you and I have talked before about the concerns that if the Democrats had their way in Washington and they had the power to do so, they would federalize elections. We're one of the few states that actually requires a photo ID, for example, and that would be out the window if they ever got control.
They would, and ultimately that's their game. And again, this coordinated effort, as we've talked about, the executive order 14019, where the president basically turned every federal agency into a get out the vote and a voter registration arm of the Democratic Party. it's a concerted effort, Gerard. We got to keep fighting every angle that we possibly can. So I hope that all Mississippians will continue to keep their eyes on this system. If you go out to vote here in November, you see something that looks kind of strange, let us know about it. That's the key, that we all play the team role here together, making sure this is done. And I want to remind you really quickly, you may have seen this, but up in LaFleur County, there was an election that a special judge came in and said basically there was fraud here. So we sent that entire file over to the AG's office. We're waiting on them to do some prosecution, but you've got to prosecute these crimes to make sure people understand we're coming after you.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so something else, we got to go, but something else I'm concerned about, Mr. Secretary, I know you're watching, is the Biden Climate Corps, which I believe is just a ballot harvesting operation in disguise. They're going to show up in this state, because they're funded by federal money. We got to be vigilant on that, and I know you're well aware of that. I just wanted our audience to know that that whole thing is a ruse. That's not really what it is.
They're coming.
Yep, exactly. Mr. Secretary, always good to see you, sir. Appreciate you joining us, and I'm sure we'll be talking soon. Take care.
Thanks, my friend.
We're coming right back, folks, in the Element Wealth studio.